Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I think a few people are still trickling in, but we have a lot to get through tonight. So I am going to get going. I'm also going to apologize in advance. I am coming to you tonight from the beautiful Fogo Island, which is an amazing place to spend some time, but also seems to be in the midst of a very windy blizzard. So if my internet cuts out, hopefully Jenna will be able to take over for us. For those of you who I haven't virtually met before, I'm Catherine Dale, and I'm coordinator of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And with me tonight is Jenna McDermott, who is the assistant coordinator and is currently showing up as Birds Canada Atlantic. And Jenna is going to be monitoring the chat and basically helping with any technical issues that come up and serving as our emergency presenter, which will hopefully not be necessary. Both Jenna and I work for Birds Canada, and apologies to those of you who've heard this spiel quite a bit. Birds Canada, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a nationwide conservation organization with the goal of advancing the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds and their habitats. This is obviously a pretty big job, and the way that we accomplish it is largely through citizen science programs. So essentially, most of our programs, most of our data collection is done by volunteers. And this must be the one time I missed this slide. So this should say that each year our programs engage more than 70,000 volunteers nationwide, which is a number that I find just stunning every time I see it, because 70,000 people out there collecting data about birds each year is pretty amazing. We are relative newcomers to Newfoundland. We established an office here in 2019, primarily to pursue this project, the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. So we're not going to go into the Atlas in detail, but there is a webinar about how the Atlas works and how you can participate on April the 17th. So please do feel free to join us for that. But basically what we're doing is we are looking to map the distribution and the abundance of all of the species of birds that breed on the island of Newfoundland. So when people see birds in the field, we ask that they submit their data to our central database so that we can create maps like the one you see there for the tree swallow, which shows where the bird has been seen, meaning that it's possibly breeding there, where we have a little bit stronger evidence that it's breeding, and then where we are sure that it's breeding, those are the red squares, that's confirmed breeding. The other program that we run here in Newfoundland is the Atlantic Nocturnal Owl Survey, and I'm also not going to get into too much depth about that tonight, but I do want to emphasize it a little bit because this is just about owl survey time of year. It's kind of crept up on me this year. So the way the owl survey works is that volunteer surveyors sign up for one route or more if they want to, and a route has 10 stops. And so you go out just one night between the 1st of April and the 15th of May, and you survey those 10 spots. At each spot, you stop and you listen briefly. You listen for 2 minutes in silence, and then you use owl playback to see if you can elicit any owl calls. We're still looking for lots of volunteers for this, and obviously there are some gaps in our route map. So if by any chance you happen to be from one of those areas like the South Coast or the Northern Peninsula, where we have very, very few routes currently, please feel free to get in touch, because not only are we looking for volunteers to fill our existing routes, but we're always trying to increase our coverage. More on the owl survey will be forthcoming over the next little while, but I just wanted to give you a heads up now that we're probably going to be doing an owl-focused webinar next Thursday. So we'll have our usual Monday webinar, which Jenna will be doing for us, but then on Thursday evening, we'll also be doing an owl webinar where we'll talk more about the owl species you find in this province, but also talk about how you participate in the survey. So if you're interested, keep your eyes on our webpage or our Facebook page, and we'll be posting the registration link for that soon. Before we start, I also want to thank our sponsors. Obviously, a breeding bird atlas in particular is a huge endeavor, something we would not be able to do without the support of all of these partner and sponsor organizations. And we wouldn't be able to offer these webinars for free without their support as well. And finally, before we get into our birds for the day, I do want to acknowledge that the lands where we conduct both the Breeding Bird Atlas and the Nocturnal Owl Survey are the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk people, who have been erased forever. Additionally, the island of Newfoundland is the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq, and these people have been protecting and stewarding the land here since time immemorial. Through the work of the Breeding Bird Atlas, we hope to contribute to this stewardship and the effort to protect all the species we share this island with. Birds Canada understands that Indigenous voices, knowledge, and ongoing work on the land are critical for wild birds to thrive in sustainable ecosystems. We support the needs, aspirations, and rights of Indigenous peoples to care for the land. And if you want to learn more about the the ancestral lands you live on, nativeland.ca is a great place to start. Okay, so birds. You'll notice that today's talk is titled Other Passerines, which is a fairly general title. It's a little bit of a grab bag today. So all the birds that didn't really fit under any other category, and also just a whole lot of birds. So we may go over the hour this time. Of course, everybody may leave when they need to. We do have their standard quiz at the end, but I'll see how fast I can go without confusing everyone, myself included. But before we get into our species, I did just want to talk a little bit about this term passerines. So what does it mean? Basically, birds belonging to the order Passeriformes, which includes more than half of the world's bird species. And essentially, we mean small perching birds. And these guys do share a lot of characteristics in common. So they tend to be small or medium. They tend to be vocal, so lots and lots of songs included in tonight's presentation. They have altricial chicks, which just means that they are not able to move when they hatch. They hatch naked with their eyes closed. They need a lot of support in the first few days of their lives. Passerines do tend to have bright plumage, although not all of them. They tend to be diurnal, and what really ties them together is their feet. So passerine feet have unwebbed toes, and the toes have tiny little talons. And the arrangement of the toes is called anisodactyl, which means 3 toes, like you can see on this guy here, facing forward and 1 facing backward. And that allows the bird to easily cling to both horizontal and vertical perches, things like branches and tree trunks. And something else that's really cool about passerine feet. So while humans, for example, we need to clench our muscles, or we need to activate our muscles to clench our fingers and toes. For passerines, it's actually the opposite. So the relaxed position of their feet is clenched, which means that the birds can perch even when they're sleeping. And so it's this toe arrangement, the 3 forward and 1 backward, and the gripping posture that makes all passerines perching birds. So now that we've figured out the title here, all passerines, we'll go into our groups of species. And the first group of species we're going to talk about is swallows. However, you'll notice that 2 of the species there are in gray, the barn swallow and the bank swallow. That is because in an effort to reduce the number of species that we needed to cover tonight, I have taken out all of the species which are listed under the Federal Species at Risk Act or the Provincial Endangered Species Act in Newfoundland. And that is because we're going to do a separate webinar in 2 weeks about species at risk in Newfoundland. So we will cover these species in that webinar, and that takes us down to, a mere 45 or something for today. So the tree swallow is the only swallow we're going to talk about today. And these guys are relatively common breeders in Newfoundland. Like all swallows, they are very graceful, very agile in the air. These guys you'll often see chasing aerial insects near open fields or water. So they really do like kind of swampy, marshy areas, and they are among my favorite birds, I have to say, because they're the first species I studied when I started working in bird research. So they're pretty distinct. They're beautiful, beautiful birds. So you can tell it's a swallow by that nice round head and very short bill. They do have a little bit of a black mask around the eye, but most of what you see is the iridescent blue back and head, and then the contrasting white throat and breast. Swallows all have very short legs, as anyone who's ever tried to band a swallow will know. So they do have those very tiny legs relative to other perching birds. And tree swallows have a short, square tail. Now, this bright blue, iridescent blue coloring and white underneath is very, very distinctive. However, younger females, so those that are breeding for the first time, can be a little bit duller. So they can look a little bit more brownish above with kind of only hints of blue. But as females age, they are essentially as blue-green as males. And when these guys are flying, you'll notice that they have broad wings and a very streamlined body. And I did just want to note that tree swallows are so named because they nest in tree cavities. So they like holes that have been made by species like woodpeckers. They're not able to excavate their own holes, but they will use cavities that have been created by other species. However, tree swallows will also readily nest in artificial nest boxes like this one here, which happens to be in the Okanagan Valley in BC. And that means that often that's where they're seen. So a lot of the tree swallows that have been reported for the Newfoundland Atlas have been reported nesting in boxes. But it also means that they're a model species for many scientific studies because it's easy to keep track of what's going on with them during the breeding season because you can just open the box and check out what's happening with their nest. Okay, so we will leave the swallows for tonight, and now we will talk about the tyrant flycatchers, which are a quite tricky group to talk about. When I talk about fly catching, what I'm talking about is flying out from a perch to catch insects on foliage or in midair, and then returning to the same perch after, which is quite different from the aerial insectivore foraging that you see in swallows, where they're just sort of constantly moving in the air. They don't really perch and fly out from that perch. We're going to talk about 4 species today, and then the 5th, the olive-sided flycatcher, is another one of those species at risk that we will cover in a couple of weeks. So our most common flycatcher is the yellow-bellied flycatcher, and you will hear these guys throughout the boreal forest during the summer. They like to breed in evergreen forest and in peatlands, but you do have to make sure that you're out there looking for them in June and July because these guys don't stick around in Newfoundland for long. They actually have one of the shortest days of any of our migratory birds, often less than 70 days here. You'll probably have guessed that one of the ways you can distinguish a yellow-bellied flycatcher is by the yellow belly, not a big surprise. They also have a nice slightly peaked head and a white eye ring, which you can see around the eye there. They have an olive back, and they have 2 wing bars, which are a little bit blocked here by the branch, but if you look carefully, you can actually see them both. You're actually more likely to hear yellow-bellied flycatchers than you are to see them, and they do have a very distinctive song, which I am going to try and play for us now. So it's a very abrupt, hoarse chebec. And then that is their call, that rising whistled weep. So those are the 2 noises that you would associate with a yellow-bellied flycatcher, and they are very common sounds to hear in the boreal forest. And I included this photo here. It's a terrible photo. Most anyone who takes photos of birds has more terrible photos than good photos. But this is of a yellow-bellied flycatcher nest that I found during the 2021 breeding season. And it basically looks like a bunch of needles. But if you look very carefully near the top, just to the right of center, you can see the bird's eye. So I happened to see a bird going into that pile of fluff there from the corner of my eye, but didn't see enough of it to determine which species it was. So I then sat on the ground for 45 minutes waiting for the bird to come out of the nest so that I could determine which species, so that I could put it into the breeding bird atlas. It was very satisfying when the yellow-bellied flycatcher came out. Our next flycatcher is the alder flycatcher, and I'm going to be honest with you, I find tyrant flycatchers quite difficult to ID. And alder flycatchers are especially tricky because they are visually identical to willow flycatchers. But luckily for us here in Newfoundland, we don't have willow flycatchers. These guys are a little bit similar to the yellow-bellied in the least as well. So you can see those 2 wing bars that we were talking about. You can see the slightly peaked head. There are some habitat differences. So alder flycatchers like wet, brushy habitats. And there's a much narrower eye ring. You don't see any yellow wash on the belly. So it's gray chest with a bit of a gray chest band there and a white throat. And you can also distinguish them by sound. So their song is a buzzy free beer. And I will play that for you now. So 2 syllables, like the yellow-bellied flycatcher, but quite a different sound. Oh, still going. All right, our next flycatcher is the least flycatcher. So this is yet another grayish olive flycatcher, but they are very small, so that is quite different. They have a very bold white eye ring, and again, they have a distinctive song. So with tyrant flycatchers, a lot of the time you want to be using the song. Least flycatchers are found in deciduous and mixed forests, generally forest clearings and edges, and they like to nest in mature hardwood trees. And on the breeding grounds, these guys actually tend to nest in clusters, so they form a flycatcher neighborhood with anywhere from 2 to 30 territories. However, in Newfoundland, they are uncommon breeders, and we mostly just find them in the southwest corner of the island. So with these guys, you're looking for that bold eye-ring, small bill, a dusky breast, and then you've got that grayish olive above again, and you've got those 2 white wing bars. Again, their small size is a good cue here, and a very small bill. So the size of the bill relative to the head helps set these guys apart. And then again, you see no yellow coloring on the breast, so you know it's not a yellow-bellied flycatcher. And their song is a short, distinctive, dry shabak, which they also sing incessantly. So let's play that. So much faster than the other two, even though, again, 2 syllables. So these are great songs to be familiar with because they will help you distinguish your flycatchers. And then the last flycatcher that we are covering today is the eastern kingbird. For once, we're not really talking about a olivey gray flycatcher. This guy is pretty distinct, also an uncommon breeder in Newfoundland, but in 2021, we did have a breeding record on the Avalon, so it is indeed possible. What you're looking for with an eastern kingbird is you've got that dark above and white below, so a striking contrast between above and below. And then across the tip of their tail, they've got a beautiful white line, which is really distinctive and makes it very easy to identify kingbirds. Okay, moving through our groups here. So next we're going to go into vireos, and we're going to talk about 3 species of vireos. And the first is by far our most common vireo. Even though Nature NL does still classify them as relatively uncommon, but that's because they mostly like deciduous forest. And so obviously there is less of that in Newfoundland than coniferous forest in a lot of cases. They like to forage in the upper reaches of the forest, and they sing a very cheerful song, which I believe is on the next slide. Basically, they're saying, here I am, way up here. So both sexes do help to build the nest in these guys. And even though I did say they forage at the tops of trees, so you often have to look up to find them, they tend to build their nest closer to the ground. And it's basically a hanging basket nest. So it's suspended from a horizontal fork in small trees or shrubs. And it is perhaps one of the more likely nests you'll encounter just because they do tend to build them lower to the ground. Blue-headed vireos are very distinctive, as their name suggests. They have a blue-gray head, but they've also got that great white spectacle pattern. So they've got a white eye ring plus a laurel spot next to the bill, which looks like they're wearing white glasses. They have 2 white wing bars and an olive green back, yellow on the flanks, and then a white breast and belly. Note that the amount of olive green on the back can vary. So in some individuals, you've got gray on the upper back, and then it kind of grades to olive green. So I'm going to play this song. This is the only vireo I have a song for, and it is worth noting that vireos tend to have quite similar songs. So before identifying it by its song, you should check the songs of the other 2 vireos we're going to talk about today. So it is a very cheerful song, and on those occasions where you can hear them but not see them, it kind of sounds like they're mocking you and saying, here I am, way up here, which can be very frustrating if you can't find them. Our next vireo species is a Philadelphia vireo, and I apologize, this isn't the best photo, but it was very difficult to find a photo of a Philadelphia vireo. These guys are uncommon breeders in Newfoundland, again, mainly in the southwestern part of the island. They are a small, stocky bird with a thick hooked bill, which is characteristic of all vireos. They've got a little hook at the end of their bill. And Philadelphia vireos are generally pretty plain and unmarked. They have a dark gray head and a grayish brown back. And then they do have that white eyebrow. So they do have some distinctive marking on the face. However, unfortunately, the white eyebrow can actually be relatively indistinct on some individuals, just to make everybody's life more difficult. They do have a yellow throat and a yellow breast and body, and they have unmarked wings. So unlike the wing bars that you see on the blue-headed vireo, these guys don't have any wing bars. So The yellow throat and the yellow breast and belly are also really good cues. However, it's also worth noting that the brightness of the yellow varies among individuals. And the last vireo species we're going to talk about is the red-eyed vireo. And I love this photo because you can actually see really clearly that little hook on the end of the bill, which is characteristic of vireos. This is, again, an uncommon breeder in Newfoundland, although certainly I have seen one in the Gander area and, again, the southwest corner of the island, I believe. They're also very common in Ontario, where I grew up, and so they were the first vireo species that I became familiar with. And so these are a larger and more aggressive vireo than the other two. And they've got that white eyebrow bordered by two distinct stripes, and that is very clear on them, unlike the Philadelphia vireo. They've got a gray crown, they have a large hooked bill, and then they have an olive green back and unmarked wings as well, and a white breast and belly. So if you're comparing the Philadelphia vireo versus the red-eyed vireo, the Philadelphia vireos are smaller, they have a shorter bill, and they are less aggressive than red-eyed vireos. Red-eyed vireos have a larger bill and a much bolder face pattern. So that really distinctive white eyebrow is surrounded by the dark lines is an easy way to tell the red-eyed vireo. They also have a cleaner breast than Philadelphia vireos, so you don't see that yellow coloring on the throat and on the breast. Probably some of you are thinking the easiest way to identify a red-eyed vireo could, be the red eye. And I do understand why you would think that. It's quite clear in that photo, but it actually can be quite difficult to see in the field. It's also worth noting that it is shown by two other vireo species, although neither of those are found in Newfoundland. So if you do catch the red eye on the vireo, you definitely have a red-eyed vireo, but it's not always easy to see. Okay, now we're going to go into the corvids, and I think these are birds that just about everyone is going to be familiar with, so we're going to race through this section. These are birds that are found worldwide, and they're well known for their intelligence. So for example, they can recognize themselves in the mirror sometimes, and they can make and use tools. And their intelligence might be why they have adapted so well to us, and they tend to be common in areas with lots of human traffic, like cities, and in the case of the Canada jay, campsites. So we are not going to spend too long on the blue jay. Everyone with a bird feeder probably recognizes these guys. So what you may not know is they do sometimes eat other birds, bird eggs, and however, most of their diet is composed of insects and nuts. Again, we have some field cues for the blue jay. They have that black necklace around the front of their neck. They have a little crest. They are, in fact, blue above, very clear white wing bar and white below, and then they've got black barring on the wings and on the tail. So the black bridle across the face, the nape and the throat, it tends to vary a lot between individuals, and it may actually help blue jays recognize each other. This guy needs virtually no introduction as well. So this is the Canada jay. This is our second jay species here in Newfoundland, and some of you are probably thinking, no, that's a gray jay. This is true. The Canada jay was a recent name change to the gray jay, and some of you may recognize him as a whiskey jack. He's not found in cities like the blue jay, but is a common denizen of campsites. So for example, when I stayed in Grossmorn, I turned my back on my cereal bowl for 1 minute and turned back to find a Canada jay sitting in it eating my Cheerios. They are often referred to as campsite robbers for exactly that reason. They are very curious, they are always looking for food, and they will eat almost anything. Part of the reason it was renamed the Canada jay is because it's present in every single Canadian province and territory. And they spend their whole year living in the northern forests, and they breed much earlier than many species. So they'll actually be rearing chicks in late winter and incubating eggs in temperatures that can drop below -25. But weirdly, these guys don't attempt a second brood in May to June, which is when all the other birds are breeding. So basically, they just rear chicks in the middle of the winter. So by the time that we are out looking for birds for the atlas in the summer, Canada jays typically have fledglings. So these guys, they're very cute little corvids. They have a small, short bill, much more so than the other corvids. They're quite fluffy looking, gray above. They have a white cheek, throat, and forehead. they're kind of a lighter gray below, and they do have quite a long tail. And because I do like to include very cool anecdotes about birds when I can, first I'm going to say that this is a fledgling Canada jay, and you can tell that by a couple of things. You can tell that it's young by the little puffiness you see around the edge of its bill. So that is the remnants of a gape. This guy is obviously kind of grayish black all over, so he looks a little bit different than his parents, but you can see that nice long tail as well. Canada jays are really interesting because what they do to manage to survive during the winter is they store food in the late summer and fall, and they use sticky saliva to glue items to tree branches, which will be above the eventual snow line in the winter months. But recent research suggests that climate change is really proving challenging for them because of this food storage habit. So there's a population in Algonquin Park in Ontario that's been studied for 40 years, and it's showing really steep declines. And researchers from the University of Guelph have found that the problem is that climate change is increasing the number of freeze-thaw cycles that the birds have to contend with. And because of this, their stored food is actually going bad because their refrigerator is no longer reliable. So because their food is going bad, they have less to eat, and that means that they have decreased reproductive success. So they are not able to rear chicks as successfully, or they are not able to rear chicks in as good condition. And so the population in Algonquin Park has declined from 85 individuals to about 50 individuals over the last 40 years or so. And this is probably something that we need to think about here in Newfoundland, because we do have large populations of gray jays or Canada jays, and they will experience the same problem with climate change. Okay, our next corvid, the American crow, again, something that you are all familiar with, very common in our cities. They usually feed on the ground, and they too eat almost anything. They like earthworms, they like insects and small animals, they like seeds and fruit, they like garbage, they like carrions, they like chicks that they steal from nests, they like other birds' eggs. These guys build large stick nests, and they are often seen carrying food, but this doesn't mean that they're bringing it to their nestlings, because American crows will carry their own food for long distances before they eat it. And they will mob perceived threats like raptors. And interestingly, I was just told about a story not that long ago and shown a picture of a great horned owl, which had been killed by a mob of American crows, which is really quite astounding when you think of the size difference between crows and a great horned owl. So, not a whole lot to say about identifying crows. You've got an all black bird, a little bit glossy, short tail, and a large, thick bill. Of course, unfortunately, we also have another bird, which is a slightly glossy all black bird with a big bill. So the bigger brother of the American crow is the common raven, which is well known for its phenomenal intelligence. And these guys, they've got a much heftier bill than the American crow. And one of the big differences is they have that thick, shaggy neck that you can see there. So when you are trying to tell the difference between a crow and a raven, you're looking for a heftier bill, a thick, shaggy neck, and a long tail. Juvenile crows may have dull brown breast and chest feathers. And I just wanted to take a moment here to compare ravens and crows, which is a question that I get asked quite a lot, actually, as a birder, and I find surprisingly difficult. It seems like something that should be easy, right? These are two of our familiar bird species, but I have seen even expert birders get this wrong during eBird photo quizzes. So the obvious answer is that crows are smaller than ravens, which is really useful if you have a crow and a raven standing beside each other, but not so useful if you only have one species, because size is a relative thing. On top of that, it seems to me, and I've also heard from one of our local birding experts, that Newfoundland has some exceptionally large crows. So the things that you can use to tell the difference between ravens and crows. The first is that shaggy throat that I talked about and the size of the bill relative to the head. So ravens have a shaggy throat and they have a bigger bill than the American crows have. But what I find is the easiest cue, and the one I use most often, is looking at them in flight. So the shape of the tail is your biggest giveaway. Raven tails are wedge or diamond shaped, as you can see in that picture there, whereas the crow tail is shorter than the raven's tail and rounded or squared. So if you can see these guys flying, that's often the easiest way to distinguish between the two of them. However, they don't always soar directly overhead in a helpful way like this. Okay, next bird group, the chickadees, nuthatches, and creepers. So again, 4 species that we're going to cover here. And I think most of you will also be familiar with this one. So it's common in urban areas as well as mixed forest, and it loves bird feeders. So this is a very small passerine, but extremely hardy. It spends the winter at northern latitudes, despite being tiny. And if you ever have had the advantage or misfortune to hold a black-capped chickadee, you know that they are extremely fierce and they love to grab the edge of your nail and twist if you happen to be trying to band them. These guys are always on the move. They flit through the small branches. And if you watch them a lot at your feeder, you may have noticed that they display a dominance hierarchy. So during the winter, they do get together in flocks, but there are set rules determining which birds in the flock are dominant over the others. And if a dominant bird wants the feeder, it will kick the subordinate off. So ways to recognize black-capped chickadees. Their black cap is a good start. They have white cheeks and a black bib, a gray back and wings, and then sort of a buffy color to their underparts. And just about everybody is familiar with the chickadee-dee-dee sound this bird makes. And I'm going to play that. However, what you may not realize is that this is not the bird's song, it's the bird's alarm call. So these calls are really interesting because the birds will vary the number of Ds, chickadee-dee versus chickadee-dee-dee-dee-dee, depending on the level of threat from their perspective. So more threatening predators get more Ds on the alarm call. And what's really cool about that is that other birds will respond differently to the chickadee alarm call, depending on how many Ds it has. So that suggests basically that other birds speak chickadee, which I think is very cool. I am also going to play the chickadee song, though, which is a simple, pure 2 or 3 note whistled bee, just so that you're aware of what the song sounds like, because I think we're probably starting to hear it in many parts of North America. I heard one singing in St. John's just the other day. So there's a lot of noise from other birds in this clip, but you can hear that whistled repeated phoebe. And that was a very nice spring-like clip, which is wonderful because it's blizzarding here. The other species of chickadee that we have in Newfoundland is the boreal chickadee. This is really exciting to me because when I moved here was the first time I had seen a boreal chickadee. They like coniferous and mixed forest, particularly those dominated by spruce or balsam fir. And like other chickadee species, these guys cache food. So they take seeds and insects that they catch during the summer, and they cache them to get them through the long, cold winter. So boreal chickadees, similar to the black-capped chickadee, but instead of a black cap, they have a brown cap. They have white cheeks and a black throat, and then a gray collar. They've got that nice sort of cinnamon russet color on their flanks. The white cheek patch is a lot smaller than the black-capped chickadee cheek patch, so that is one way to tell a difference, but the cinnamon flanks and the brown cap will also help. These guys also make a chickadee call, like our black-capped chickadees, but it's a bit slower and it's buzzier and more nasal. So the way I remember it is it sounds like a black-capped chickadee that's been smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So that is our boreal chickadee. You could also think of it as a very whiny chickadee. That sometimes can help too. Okay, and now we're talking about the red-breasted nuthatch, also one of my favorite birds. I'm starting to realize that most of the birds seem to be my favorite birds, so that's an interesting realization. This is our only species of nuthatch in Newfoundland. It's a frequent visitor at feeders, and you can see it often moving up and down and around tree trunks, often with its head pointing down and its butt pointing up. So they have been referred to as ass-ups for their habit of creeping headfirst down a tree trunk. These guys like spruce and fir forests as well, and like both chickadee species, they are cavity nesters, so they nest inside cavities in trees, but unlike the tree swallows that I started this presentation with, red-breasted nuthatches will actually excavate their own cavities. So these guys, very distinctive. They've got a white eyebrow and a black eyeline, and then a white crown. So very distinctive facial markings. They're blue-gray above, and then they're rusty below, which is obviously where they get the name red-breasted nuthatch. But it is worth mentioning that the amount of red can vary a lot. So I've seen that red-breasted nuthatches with very pale breasts. And females look similar to male, but they are paler. So often those ones with the much paler rusty breasts are in fact females. I've included their calls here because you will often hear them in the forest, and it's one of those sounds that carries. So it's often really satisfying to be able to put a name to the sounds you hear. So they make these nasal yank yank calls that sound kind of like tiny tin horns being honked in the treetops. Very repetitive and monotonal. And the last guy in this group is the brown creeper, which is named for its unique approach to feeding. So like woodpeckers, they've got those nice stiff tails, which you can see in the picture there, and they use those to prop themselves up on tree trunks and probe the bark for insects and spiders with that long curved bill of theirs. However, they do behave quite differently than woodpeckers, because what they do is they start at the base of the tree and explore for insects there, and then they go up the tree trunk in a spiral until they get to the top, and then they fly away to a new tree and start at the bottom again. So they'd creep up the trees. They like old growth closed canopy forest during the breeding season, but during the winter, they tend to spread out a bit, and one can often be found in Bowring Park in St. John's. As I said, we're looking at a long, stiff tail here. On the back, they are mottled brown. They've got that nice, thin, curved down bill, and then white underparts. They are quite cryptically colored, so they do blend into the bark of trees very well and can be challenging to spot. Okay, we're getting there. We're moving on to our kinglets now, and we only have 2 species of kinglets here. So the first is the ruby-crowned kinglet. Kinglets are very tiny songbirds, and they are always on the move. So they forage with twitchy motions, lots of wing flicking, and this fantastic photo, which was taken by a Newfoundland atlaser, Tina Randall, is amazing because I have no idea how she managed to get a kinglet to sit still long enough to take this photo. I tried all summer to get photos of kinglets, and I have a lot of photos of empty branches and blurry tails. So you may think that because it's such a small bird, it would probably make a pretty quiet song. Do not be fooled. This is one of the loudest songs you will come across. So it's very easy to think just by its volume that it must be a larger bird, but no, it is in fact a kinglet. And even though these guys are really, really tiny, female ruby-crowned kinglets can lay up to 12 eggs per clutch. So these guys really punch above their weight. So what you're looking for in a ruby-crowned kinglet, you've got yellow-edged wing and tail feathers, olive green above. You've got lovely white wing bars with black below them, if you look closely, and a white eye ring. And then, of course, you've got that lovely ruby crown. However, that is only flashed by adult males when they are excited or agitated. Otherwise, they lay it flat and it's concealed. So don't rely on the color of the crown or don't rely on seeing a ruby crown or a orangey crown to identify these guys. Our other species of kinglet, however, the golden crowned kinglet, you can rely on the color of the crown. These guys, unlike ruby-crowned kinglets, are resident year-round in Newfoundland. So even though they are similarly tiny, they are able to withstand winter temperatures of up to -40 Celsius. So they're smaller than chickadees, they're smaller than warblers, but they are tough. Golden crowned kinglets nest mainly in black spruce and balsam fir dominated forests. And despite the short breeding season of the boreal forest, these guys usually manage to raise 2 broods of young. So they feed the first set of fledglings once they've left the nest for only a day or 2, and then they begin laying their second nest. And the male will take care of the fledglings for a little longer, but the female focuses on the second nest. So again, these guys are tiny birds that really punch above their weight. Cues on these guys, very distinct facial and head markings. So they've got a white line over the eye, and they've got that bright yellow crown bordered by black stripes. They have a white wing bar and yellow edged tail and wing feathers like the ruby-crowned kinglet. The difference really is in the face with the kinglets. So you're looking at the facial patterns with the bold patterns on the golden crown kinglet and a relatively plain face on ruby crown kinglets. Okay, and now we move into our section about thrushes. And really, this is one that Jenna should be covering because she is our resident thrush expert. So direct your thrush questions to Jenna. We are going to be talking about 4 of our 5 species here today. The gray cheek thrush will be covered during our Species at Risk webinar. First is the veery. These are, again, a relatively uncommon breeder in Newfoundland. And again, one of these species that we pretty much only find in the southwestern part of the province. There is one reliably on the Starlight Trail in the Codroy Valley, I've been told. It may be the province's only veery, but it's always there. These guys like damp mixed forest, and that's kind of what they like about southwestern Newfoundland. And they really like shrubby understory. They're typically found in the understory foraging in the leaf litter. So veeries are uniformly cinnamon brown above. So both the back and the tail are this cinnamon brown color. They do have a little bit of indistinct spotting on the throat and breast, but they've got these pale underparts with relatively little spotting and a plain face. And so these are things that help distinguish it from other thrush species. Next, we have the Swainson's thrush, and this guy breeds primarily in spruce fir and mixed forest. And it does forage in the understory as well, but stays slightly higher up than most other thrushes, and it will chase flying insects as well. It is more often seen than heard, and it really does have a beautiful song. It's almost like a flute, and it spirals upwards, which is unique. But the song is actually not as easy to track as you might think. It can actually be very, very difficult to track because the bird singing it can move quickly from one perch to another between songs. But also the quality of the sound reverberates very much in the dense foliage. And sometimes Swainson's thrush sings very quiet songs. So that creates the illusion that they're singing from much farther away. So the cues for these guys, you'll notice in contrast to the plain face of the veery, you've got a buffy eye-ring and lores. So again, you've got a little bit of that spectacled look that we saw in the blue-headed vireo. You've got a buffy wash on the breast, and then you've got lots more dark spotting on the throat and breast than you had on the veery. They're olive brown above rather than reddish brown, and they have pale underparts. Third species of thrush I want to talk about is the hermit thrush. Again, an understory bird like the other thrushes. These guys like near edges and openings. They are ground nesters and ground foragers, so they tend to hop while they forage in leaf litter, and their posture is usually erect with the bill slightly raised, and they'll often flick their wings and then raise their tail like this guy has when perched. These guys are the only thrush of its genus, which is Catharus, that remains in North America for the winter. So it does move south from the breeding grounds, but it does not move as far south as many of the other species of thrush. And this could be because they add fruit to their diet during the winter. They don't just depend on insects, so that may allow them to winter a little bit farther north. So with hermit thrushes, you see an eye-ring, but you don't see that spectacled look that you saw in the Swainson's thrush. You've got brown above, but then you've got a reddish tail and rump. So here, unlike the veery and the Swainson's thrush, you see a contrast between the color of the back and the color of the tail. And that is often the most useful cue for identifying a hermit thrush. You have spots on the throat and smudge spots on the breast and pale underparts. The spots on the flank here on the side are lighter and smudgier than on the Swainson's thrush. And I did have to include the hermit thrush song because it is my absolute favorite bird song. It sounds totally ethereal to me. It's a little bit like the Swainson's thrush song. So again, that fluty sound, but it doesn't spiral up. And unlike Swainson's thrush, hermit thrush songs start with a single pure note. So that song makes a wonderful accompaniment to seeing the sunrise in the field. And our last thrush is one that I'm sure you're all familiar with, so I'm not going to spend too long on him again, the American robin. They're often considered a harbinger of spring. That is not necessarily always the case because these guys are actually year-round residents through much of their range, including the southern portion of Newfoundland. So they're at home almost anywhere, from woodlands to urban yards. You see them just about everywhere. And the range and habitat of the species has actually expanded because of urban and agricultural expansion. These guys were named after European robins because they share the red breast that is so obvious in European robins, but they're not actually closely related to them at all. These guys lay distinctive blue eggs, as many of you are probably aware. And so it's worth mentioning that broken eggshells, as long as they look like they have been laid relatively recently, are evidence of breeding. So parents will take eggshells out of the nest, fly them a short distance away, and drop them. And so because robin eggs are so distinctive, that bright blue color, you can actually use that as evidence that robins are breeding. So what you're looking for here is a dark head, a yellow bill, some black streaks on the throat, and then that beautiful red breast. You can't really see the dark streaks on this guy's throat because his head is bent. Females and immature robins are paler than males, with more white on the belly and the throat, but it is often difficult to distinguish between sexes and ages in these birds. Okay, I think this is our second last group, the blackbirds, and we have 4 species, but we're only going to cover the 2, and we'll do the bobolink and the rusty blackbird in a couple of weeks. The first bird we're going to talk about is the red-winged blackbird. It is not common here in Newfoundland, but it is one of the most common birds in North America. So these guys in Newfoundland, we found them mostly in the southwestern part of the island, although there are reports as well from some marshes on the Avalon. So these guys, like marshes and swamps, they're extremely territorial, and you will often see fights between the males as they compete to claim and defend territories. So this guy is a displaying male. They'll sit on cattails and other high perches, spread their wings, and puff out their shoulder patches, and then they'll sing. So male red-winged blackbirds are pretty easy to identify. You've got the red shoulder patch or epaulette with the yellow border, and then black plumage and a slender conical bill. However, females are less conspicuous. So female red-winged blackbirds are kind of brown striped birds with yellow wash around the bill. So they are a little bit more difficult to identify. And next we have the common grackle, which is another bird that is found primarily in the southwest corner of the island, but there is also a population on the Avalon Peninsula. So you can reliably see these guys in St. John's, and it looks like their breeding range is expanding to cover the entire island. They eat many crops, notably corn. We don't have a lot of crops here, but they eat pretty much anything else as well, including garbage. They will come to bird feeders, as in the picture here. Both male and female common grackles sing, and their song sounds a little bit like the squeak of a rusty gate. So it's sort of a guttural squeak plus whistles, and when they sing, males puff up their body feathers and spread their tails. So common grackles look like they're blackbirds that have been stretched. They're large, they have a very long, broad tail, and then they've got a bronze body. It looks dark in certain lights, but then if the light hits them right, you can see that it is that iridescent bronze, and they've got an iridescent blue head. They have a bright yellow eye and a large bill and long legs. So these are pretty substantial birds. And our last group of birds is everything else, basically. And this year, anybody who attended last year will probably or may remember that we did forget a species last year. We forgot the horned lark, but they have been included this year. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the winter wren. So this is a very tiny bird, and it has what is a distinctive wren posture. So you can see that tail sticking straight up at the back. And that is how wrens usually pose. It's the only wren species that we have here in Newfoundland, so it's easy to identify. But it is often heard rather than seen, and has a very, very loud song for its tiny size. Very high pitched, just sort of an endless flow of tinkling noises. It's timid. It forages on the forest floor in the undergrowth, but you will often hear it, and the song does travel long distances. It's not particularly common here in Newfoundland, but the range does encompass the entire island, and we certainly did run across a number of them in the field this past summer. They like old growth forests, so both deciduous and evergreen. because they like downed logs and tangled understory. So for these guys, again, the main thing you're looking for is that straight upright tail, but they are brown overall with a pale eyebrow, barring on the wings, tail, and belly, and paler below. And they often bob their entire body as if they were doing squats at the gym while they look around the forest understory. And here we have another not super common bird in Newfoundland. And in fact, if you look up the current range maps for the gray catbird, you'll see that it doesn't include Newfoundland at all. But we do see a few every year, and 2021 was a particularly good year for gray catbirds. And we did find evidence that they were breeding here. So these guys, like mockingbirds, are mimics. They imitate the songs of many other species, and they sing all day, not just in the morning and evening, as many birds do. Their name, catbird, comes from the mewing call they make, which does sound a lot like a cat. Identifying cues for these guys, you see that dark black cap. They're a gray bird overall. They're a fairly sizable bird. They've got a nice long tail, and you can't see it in this picture, but the undertail coverts are cinnamon colored. So you do see a bright patch of cinnamon there. They often perch with their tail down the way this guy is doing. So it gives them a little bit of a hunched look. Like I think if my grandmother saw that guy, she would tell him to sit up straight. He needs better posture. And the American pipit. These guys are great. Cornell describes them as slender, nondescript songbirds. I think that's a little bit harsh, to be honest. But part of the reason that we often may not identify them is they really like remote areas. So you can reliably see these guys, for example, on the barrens at Cape St. Mary's and along sections of the East Coast Trail. They're ground dwellers, and they like open areas like tundra and alpine habitat and barrens. They're not particularly shy, but they are little brownish birds, as you can see, and so it can be hard to see them. They do look a bit like sparrows, again, with the little brownish birds, but you'll notice that the long, thin bill is very different from the conical shape that Jenna was talking about when she talked about sparrows. And these guys also have a tendency to bob their tails when they're perched or walking, and sparrows don't usually do that. So when you're looking to identify a pipit, you're looking for a long, thin bill, again, quite different from the sparrows that might be in the same habitat. It does have a pale eyebrow, so you can see a yellowish eyebrow there. It's grayish brown above, and it's streaky below. And you've got white edges on the outermost tail feathers, which can flash when they fly, so that can be an excellent ID cue. And I included this photo because this is one of the only other nests that I have stumbled across in the field. This was in Grossmoor National Park, and if you look in the middle there, you can see some pipit eggs. So these guys are ground nesters, and they're very adept at camouflaging their nests. Okay, and the horned lark, to be given its due in this year's presentation. So these are also small, roughly sparrow-sized birds that really like open habitats, like the pipit. They're pretty common, but they've undergone a pretty sharp decline in the last 50 years. And one of the very cool things about them is that when they nest on the ground, the females will excavate themselves a little nest scrape. And then around the scrape, they will place pavings, so things like pebbles and clods of dirt, which they basically place beside the nest that almost ends up resembling a walkway, but it turns out that is not what the birds use it for, but definitely something to keep your eye out for in the field. And as you can tell, this horned lark has a nest full of hungry mouths to feed. So these guys can be surprisingly camouflaged when you're seeing them from the back because they do like these open areas. They like agricultural fields, for example, dirt, grasses, and they are brown above. And so they can be quite hard to see until they turn around and look at you. And then you'll see those very distinctive facial markings. So they have a black mask and a yellow head and throat, and then a black chest band. And then they're pale below. They do have these feathers on the sides of their head, which can stand up like horns, and that's where they get their name. However, they are not always raised, so it's not the most reliable of ID cues. And they have a black tail, which you may not notice when they're hopping around in the field, but is very noticeable in flight. Females look a lot like the males, but they don't have the black mask, and they are paler, so they've got much less of a yellow wash on the throat than the males do, and they have a brown chest band instead of a black chest band. And another bird with a black mask, the cedar waxwing. These guys are distinctive and beautiful. And as a bander, I can also say they are the softest, smoothest birds I've ever captured. These guys tend to travel in flocks. They make very high-pitched calls, and they prefer to eat berries. They are voracious eaters. When a flock of cedar waxwings descends on your tree, they can basically strip a tree of berries very quickly. Because they do eat so many berries, these guys are also birds that are known to become drunk if they eat fermented fruit. Cedar waxwings are interesting because they breed somewhat later in the year than many other bird species, because they're waiting for fruit to ripen before they breed. So cues for these guys, you have a black mask with white edging, brown head and chest with a nice crest on it, red tips on the secondaries, yellow tips on the tail, and a yellowish belly. The name waxwing refers to the bright red spots on the end of their secondary feathers, which reminded people of drops of sealing wax when people used to use sealing wax to seal letters. And they are indeed a waxy secretion, but we don't know exactly what the function of them is. There really isn't much you can misidentify for cedar waxwing, with the exception of our other waxwing, the Bohemian waxwing. So Bohemian waxwings do not breed in Newfoundland, so they're only present in the winter. So if you see a waxwing during the breeding season, it's a cedar waxwing, but it is worth knowing how to tell the difference between them because they do initially look quite similar, but there are a few things that you can look for. So Bohemian waxwings have wing bars, as you can see in that photo there. Cedar waxwings do not. The other thing that you can look for is the overall coloration of the birds. So cedar waxwings are sort of browny color and a more delicate bird overall. Bohemian waxwings are bigger and they're grayish. And then the final cue to use is the undertail coverts. So you can see in that picture of a Bohemian waxwing that he has nice cinnamon undertail coverts that really stand out against his grayish feathers. Whereas the cedar waxwing, you can just see at the edge of the feather there, actually has white vent area as opposed to that cinnamon color. So those are the cues, but during the breeding season, you don't need to worry about it. Okay, and we have almost made it. This is our last bird of the day, and not one of my favorite birds, and I don't think really anyone's favorite bird, the European starling. And it's a bit of a sad note to end on because it's an invasive species, as many people are aware, but it is probably the single most common bird you will come across, especially in cities. And I didn't want to leave it out in case anyone is unfamiliar with it. So all of the millions and millions of European starlings in North America are descended from 100 individuals set loose in Central Park in New York in the 1890s by a group of British colonies who wanted to, British colonists who wanted to bring all of the birds that were mentioned in Shakespeare to the New World, which turns out was not a great idea. So today we have more than 200 million individuals, and this has caused declines in some of our native species, particularly those that, like the starling, breed in cavities in trees, but aren't able to excavate their own. So cavities are a limiting resource for them, and starlings do like to muscle other birds out of cavities. So for example, starlings were thought to be partly responsible for the decline of eastern bluebirds in the mid-20th century. So to figure out that you have a starling, you see dark overall, but you see iridescence on the bird. So there's a purple-green iridescence and a yellow bill. Overall dark bird, relatively large. Non-breeding birds have spotted back and underparts, but most lose the spots as the breeding season begins. So the bill is also black during the winter, but then it turns yellow at the beginning of the breeding season. So this picture where you can see some of the spots and you can see that the black, there is still some black in the bill, was probably taken in the early spring. These guys are great vocal mimics. They can make all kinds of weird sounds, and they can learn the songs of up to 20 species. So sound is actually not a terribly reliable cue for identifying European starlings. Okay, so that was a whirlwind tour of other passerines, basically everything we could throw in there. And that's all our birds for tonight. But I do have 8 skill testing questions to see if you were listening. So we will go through those now, assuming that I can launch the poll. Okay, so what do we have here in this picture? And again, if the poll on your screen is covering the picture, you can just grab it and move it. Okay. All right, we've got, oh yeah, we've got almost 80% participation. All right, just a couple more. Excellent. Okay, final guesses. All right, we'll end the poll here. Share the results. So the overwhelming majority of you, 88%, said this was a brown creeper, and you are in fact correct. So you see those nice stiff outer tail feathers. You see that decurved bill, and then this sort of camouflagey back that would blend in very well with the bark. Red-breasted nuthatch, I did mention that the red breast can be very, very pale, but if you were to see it on a tree like this, it would probably be pointing the other way with its butt up in the air and its bill pointing down. And then least flycatcher and Philadelphia vireo, both you would expect to see more of an upright stance, particularly the least flycatcher. All right, what about this guy, if I can launch this poll? There we go. Who do we have here? Okay, opinions a little more split on this one. Remember, there's no consequences for guessing the wrong thing. Throw your hat in the ring. All right, last guesses. We can put them in now. Okay, and I'm going to end the poll now. Okay, so definitely a lot more split on this one, with most people guessing it was either a Philadelphia vireo or a yellow-bellied flycatcher. The answer is Philadelphia vireo, but this one was tricky. It does have that yellow wash on it, so I can absolutely see where yellow-bellied flycatcher came from. Remember, with flycatchers, you're generally going to see them sitting more upright on a perch that they will sally forth from to grab their insects. Red-eyed vireo, so it is a vireo. It's got that vireo bill. However, with red-eyed vireo, you would expect to see a much more distinctive face pattern. This guy has the yellow eyebrow, but it is not bordered by a dark crown and a dark eye stripe. And then ruby-crowned kinglet, also a good guess because they have very nondescript, non-marked faces like this guy, but you would expect to see the wing bars on a ruby-crowned kinglet. Okay, so next one. I'm guessing as soon as I can launch the poll, the answers will start rolling in here. Really, it comes down to two. I think most of you will agree. And so far, everyone is converging on the one answer. Okay, last answers. Anyone in doubt? Wanting to put theirs in? Okay, I'm going to end the poll here. And I don't think this has ever happened before. 100% got this question right. This is indeed a common raven. So I really don't need to say this, but here you're looking at the shagginess of the throat, that really big bill, and then the long tail, which you can kind of see in this picture, is diamond-shaped rather than fan-shaped. So well done, everyone, 100%. And I was trying to be very tricky with those other answers. Okay, and next question. Who do we have here? Okay, we've got 50% participation, just a few more. And we'll close the poll. Okay, I'm going to stop it there and share the results. And again, this one's a little bit more mixed because it is a tricky one. It is, in fact, a ruby-crowned kinglet, even though you cannot see a ruby crown on it. It's not a blue-headed vireo because we don't see that bluish head. We don't see vireo bill with the hook at the end. And we don't see those white spectacles, which are really characteristic of the blue-headed vireo. There's a white eye ring, but there isn't that white spot by the lores, which makes it look like it's wearing glasses. It's not a golden crown kinglet because it has an unmarked face. So even though it does have the wing bar and it does have the yellow edging on the wing and tail feathers, you don't see the markings on the head. You don't see that golden crown. It is not a least flycatcher, although that is a little bit of a tricky one because least flycatchers do also have wing bars and they do also have a white eye ring. But again, with flycatcher, you want that upright posture with the tail extending sort of down past the perch. And you also would expect a little bit of a peaked head, and this guy has a very rounded head. Also, for what it's worth, kinglets are much smaller than flycatchers. All right, nice job, everyone. I know these are tricky ones. Like as we know, I am much meaner than Jenna with these. So here's a nice tricky thrush question. Oh, and I've already eliminated one of the answers. That was very silly of me. Okay, participation is coming in. We're at 80%. Any last guesses? All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And great job. More than 50% of you got it right. It is indeed a hermit thrush. I appreciate that some of you still guessed American pipit because I did actually say it was a thrush question. So thank you for guessing pipit anyway and making me feel better. Pipits would be down on the ground. They're ground birds as opposed to our thrushes, which are understory birds, but you see them a little bit more up high like this. This is a hermit thrush mainly because of the difference between the tail feathers, that nice cinnamony rusty brown color, and the back. So Veery's would be cinnamony rusty brown all over, and they would have a relatively unmarked breast. And Swainson's thrush would be sort of the brownish all over without that contrasting tail, and they would have a buffy eye ring and spectacles, essentially. So we have our hermit thrush here. Okay. And third last question. So who do we have here? Okay. Any last guesses? We're over 80% participation, so I'm going to stop our poll now. Okay, and these are of course the flycatchers with that upright posture that I kept talking about, and none of you guessed kinglet, so well done. This is a yellow-bellied flycatcher. Flycatchers, not easy. However, it is yellow-bellied and not alder or least because of that yellow wash on the belly. Very tricky. Song would be very helpful in this case because the songs are quite distinctive. Okay, just two more questions. So tell me who we've got here. All right, we've got 85% participation. Excellent. Any last guesses? Okay, people seem pretty sure of this one. So I will end and share the results of the poll. And more than 90% of you knew that this was a horned lark, so well done. Again, I tried to be very tricky with the answers that I put in there, although I see nobody guessed red-breasted nuthatch. So American pipit, they are ground-dwelling birds like horned lark. They're about the same size. However, on a pipit, you would not see those distinctive facial markings that you see on the horned lark. The cedar waxwing was in there also as a trick because they do have a black mask like this. However, they have a brown face and they have a black throat patch. And then they have a little bit of a crest, whereas horned larks often do have those little horn feathers sticking up at the sides of their head, but this guy does not have them up at the moment. If it were a cedar waxwing, you would also see yellowish underneath, and then you would see bright red wingtips on the secondary wing feathers, which I think you could just see in this photo, and yellow tips on the tail. Okay, and tonight's last question here, I hope will be a good note to end on. Who do we have here? Okay. Last call for guesses. Just a few more. We're at over 80% participation again. Put in your guess. Okay, and I will end the poll now. Okay, and again, almost 90% of you said that this was a tree swallow, which in fact it is. So well done. Eastern kingbird, I put in there because when I started birding, I found the two of them quite difficult to distinguish because Eastern kingbirds are also basically dark above and white below. There is a big size difference though. Kingbirds are much larger than tree swallows. There's a difference in the size of the bill. So you can see that very tiny swallow bill on the tree swallow. And also kingbirds do have a white line across the bottom of their tail, which is very distinctive. Blue-headed vireo, also a little bit tricky because this guy does in fact have a blue head. However, with the vireo, again, you would expect a much larger bill with that vireo hook on the end. And then with blue-headed vireos, remember those white spectacles. So they have a white eye ring and they have a white marking on the lores. So that's a really good way of distinguishing a blue-headed vireo. Okay, and we have gone almost 15 minutes over. So thank you to those of you who stuck with us tonight. That is all I have for you, but we will be back next week where Jenna will take us, rather than through groups of species, through various habitat types that you might find here on the island of Newfoundland, and give us some idea what species of birds we might expect to find in those habitats. So I hope that you will join us for that webinar next week, and I hope that some of you will be able to make it out to our OWL webinar next week as well. In the meantime, have a great week, everyone, and happy spring. It's our first day of spring today, despite the blizzard outside. So, you know, the robins are on their way.
Thanks, Catherine. That was really a great presentation, packed full of info. I've told everyone in the chat that I'll just send the question and answers that came in during the follow-up email. So we won't go into those now since we're a bit over time. But someone is just asking again, when is the OWL webinar? So could you just remind us the date?
The OWL webinar will be next Thursday, which I believe is the 30th of March, and it will be at 7:30 like our standard webinars are.
And I'll send the registration info for that out in the follow-up email as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jenna.
Yeah, no worries. And then just one thing, someone was wondering if you'd be able to put up the slide again where you had the yellow-bellied flycatcher nest and point out where the nest is, because it's very hard to see. And if they're still here, they would like to see where it is.
Okay, let me see what I can do here. I think I need to stop sharing my screen and then
find the slide and go
find the slide, yeah, and then put it up again, because and it is really hard. And for some reason this year, I don't know why, because that hasn't been the case in previous years, but for some reason this year, we can't seem to use the cursor to point things out. So I wasn't able to draw a circle around the vireo this year, or the vireo nest this year. Okay, let's see if I can do this. I'm gonna share my screen. I'm gonna share my PowerPoint. Okay, so you should be able to, can you actually see my cursor now? If I do this. Okay, that is the bird's eye right there. So this is the bird's face. And this hanging thing here is the nest, but it is not easy to see. I completely agree with you, which is why it took me a good 45 minutes to figure out what was going on here.
That is very tricky. Thanks for showing us that.
No problem.
Yeah, as I said, I think the other questions will pop into the follow-up email for people to read. And yes, thanks everybody again for coming out tonight. Hopefully we'll see you again next week.
Thanks, guys. Have a great week.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Jenna.
Bye.
Bye.